The most expensive mistake in an economic collapse is not buying the wrong thing. It is buying things whose value only exists if the system keeps its promises. That is the deeper truth. Most people think collapse destroys by smashing, burning, looting, empty shelves, closed banks. Those things can happen. But the more important destruction is quieter than that. The object remains. The contract remains. The paperwork remains. The title remains. The degree remains. The insurance policy still has your name on it. The car still sits in the driveway. The apartment still stands. Nothing looks gone, and yet the value is gone. That is what middle-class people almost never get taught. They are taught to think in terms of assets. Collapse teaches in terms of dependencies. So let me give you the one mother line that everything in this story serves. Economic collapse does not mainly destroy things. It destroys the system conditions that made those things economically useful. That is the line. Not theft alone, not war alone, not vandalism alone. System failure. Because once the system underneath prices, contracts, liquidity, and enforceable exchange starts breaking, the purchases people made in obedience to that system begin failing in the same order every time. Not randomly, mechanically. Real estate bought at the wrong point becomes an anchor. A car bought on credit becomes dead weight. Long-term financial products become paper promises denominated in a dying unit. Degrees become credentials for jobs that no longer exist. Consumer goods become clutter bought with capital that can never be recovered. That is not a moral lesson. It is a structural one. And that is why I do not want to tell this story as a list. I want to tell it as a map. Now let me show you the mechanisms. The first mechanism is system dependence. A purchase is never just the thing itself. It is the thing plus the system that makes the thing useful. A house requires mortgage markets, buyers, credit, tax stability, insurance, and enough income in the population to sustain demand. A car requires fuel, roads, spare parts, imported components, mechanics, insurance, registration systems, and enough purchasing power to keep all of those services alive. A pension requires solvent institutions, honest accounting, a functioning currency, and a government that honors contracts rather than rewriting them. A degree requires an economy whose labor market still values the specialization it signaled when you enrolled. Consumer goods require maintenance, replacement channels, and a world in which consumption still means progress rather than misplaced capital. That is system dependence. Once you see it, the illusion breaks. The object is not the value. The functioning system around the object is the value. And when people say an economic collapse makes some purchases useless, that is what they are really describing. Not that the object physically disappears, but that the invisible system around it stops doing its job. That is a much more dangerous kind of failure, because people keep staring at the object while missing the structure that gave it meaning. Now let us move to the second mechanism. I call it liquidity death. Real estate is the most emotionally protected myth in the middle-class imagination. People say land is real, property always comes back. A home is your greatest asset. They say these things with the confidence of religion. I do not treat them like religion. I treat them like conditional claims. A property is only an asset in the practical sense if it can be sold, financed, rented, taxed, and maintained inside a functioning economic architecture. Once that architecture fails, property becomes much more ambiguous. The building still stands, but if buyers vanish, if mortgages disappear, if taxes rise while income falls, and if no one can convert the property into cash without taking a ruinous loss, then the asset is no longer serving as an asset. That is liquidity death. This is why real estate is so cruel in collapse. The public thinks of it as tangible safety, but what they often really own is an illiquid claim resting on the assumption that somebody else can and will buy it later under similar institutional conditions. In crisis, those conditions do not hold. The house is still there. The market is gone. That is the trap. A trapped asset is not safety. It is a hostage. And if the owner also carries debt against it, then the trap gets worse. Now, the property is not merely unsellable. It is a cost center funded by income that is itself under pressure. That is how the greatest asset becomes the thing that pins a family to a shrinking balance sheet. Now let us move to the third mechanism. I call it network failure. A car looks like a machine. In reality, it is a subscription to a network. Fuel, parts, repair, insurance, roads, registration, imports, currency convertibility, all of these things are embedded in the experience of owning a car, which is why a car purchased on credit during a stable consumer economy can suddenly become absurd in a collapsing one. The owner thinks he bought mobility. What he often bought was access to a whole system that can fail faster than the car itself. That is network failure. When fuel becomes scarce, when tires and spare parts can only be imported in hard currency, when mechanics cannot source what they need, when insurance is nominally present but practically meaningless, then the new car does not protect the owner. It mocks him, the debt remains. The utility vanishes. That is the deepest insult in collapse. The liability survives better than the usefulness. This is why leveraged purchases of network-dependent goods become so destructive. The middle class buys them because they feel like entry into a stable modern life. But once the surrounding network fails, the object itself is stranded, and stranded goods are economically dead, no matter how shiny they still look. Now let us move to the fourth mechanism. I call it promise decay. Long-term financial products are sold as prudence, insurance, annuities, pensions, retirement accounts, long-duration savings structures. The responsible class loves these because they feel morally clean. Delay gratification now, receive safety later. That bargain works beautifully in a system that keeps the unit of account honest, preserves institutional solvency, and respects legal continuity. Collapse attacks exactly those assumptions. That is promise decay. A pension is only valuable if the institution paying it remains able and willing to pay in money that still means something. A life policy is only protective if the payout arrives in a unit whose purchasing power still matters. A retirement account is only secure if the state does not seize, restructure, inflate away, freeze, or haircut the claims inside it. This is why collapse punishes the obedient middle class with such precision. Their wealth is not usually in smuggled gold bars or foreign cash or cross-border structures. It is in promises, indexed promises, regulated promises, highly respectable promises, promises built on the faith that the state, the institution, the currency, and the legal order will all remain coherent long enough for delayed compensation to arrive intact. That is a tremendous bet. People just do not experience it as a bet until the system stops honoring it in real terms. Then the curtain lifts. Now let us move to the fifth mechanism. I call it credential mismatch. A degree is not useless because knowledge is useless. A degree becomes economically wounded because it was a credential aimed at a specific labor market that may not survive the collapse in the form you expected. That is credential mismatch. The family thinks it purchased future security. What it often purchased was a bet on the continuity of a particular economic structure. The office economy stays intact. The professional class remains protected. The state or private sector continues needing this category of specialist. Migration does not undercut the salary premium. Automation does not flatten the roll. Debt can be serviced from the income the credential unlocks. That is a lot of hidden assumptions. A collapse or deep systemic contraction shreds those assumptions at once. Suddenly, an engineer is overqualified and underemployed. A lawyer finds there are not enough clients. An accountant discovers there is no healthy corporate middle left to serve. A graduate enters a labor market that values survival work more than formal qualification. The knowledge still exists. The pricing signal for that knowledge has failed. This is one of the saddest parts of collapse because it destroys faith in the thing most meritocratic societies Tell their children to trust above all else. Study hard, earn the credential. The market will reward competence. Sometimes it does, until the market itself loses the ability to clear that promise. Then competence remains. The income disappears. Now let us move to the sixth mechanism. I call it consumption weight. This is where the whole consumer model reveals its fragility. A functioning middle-class economy tells people that building a life means surrounding themselves with things. Electronics, furnishings, renovations, installment purchases, nice versions of ordinary objects, the whole vocabulary of earned comfort. In calm times, this feels rational because the income stream, the service network, and the replacement structure all make those purchases seem like part of a coherent life. In collapse, they become weight. That is consumption weight. The television cannot be converted into liquidity. The sofa cannot pay a tax bill. The home theater cannot be swapped for medicine at anything close to its purchase price. The renovated kitchen cannot generate income. The consumer goods bought on credit become two losses at once. Capital already spent and obligations still owed. This is why I say collapse punishes purchases whose usefulness depended on stable surplus. Consumer goods are fine in a stable system because surplus exists to sustain them. When surplus vanishes, the difference between resilience and decoration becomes brutally clear. That is not anti-consumption moralizing. It is hierarchy. In stress, the things that matter narrow fast. Most purchases do not belong in that narrowing circle. Now let us move to the seventh mechanism. I call it middle-class concentration. The wealthy survive collapse better not because they are morally superior. The poor sometimes survive collapse differently, not because they are untouched. The middle class gets hit with special brutality because it is the class most fully integrated into the formal promises of the system. That is middle-class concentration. Its wealth is in leveraged homes. Its mobility is in financed cars. Its future is in pensions and credentials. Its identity is in lawful, respectable participation. Its habits are built around the assumption that rules continue to hold. That is the hidden concentration. All the purchases look diversified on the surface. House, car, education, retirement account, consumer comfort. In reality, they are all one bet. The bet that systemic stability persists. When that single bet fails, everything fails together. That is why collapse feels surgical. It is not attacking random possessions. It is attacking a class whose entire way of storing value, signaling responsibility, and planning the future was routed through the same formal architecture. Once that architecture breaks, every pillar leans in the same direction. Now I want to force the identity shift, because without it, this still sounds like a pessimistic documentary, rather than a usable framework. Stop thinking like a buyer of things. Start thinking like a dependency auditor. A buyer asks what object or contract he is getting. A dependency auditor asks what system conditions must remain true for the object or contract to keep its value. A buyer sees a house. A dependency auditor sees taxes, liquidity, buyers, wages, and debt service. A buyer sees a pension. A dependency auditor sees the currency, the state, the fund, and the legal regime. A buyer sees a degree. A dependency auditor sees the labor market. That is the stronger identity, because once you think that way, you stop treating major life purchases as isolated decisions and start seeing them as bundles of hidden systemic assumptions. That is the whole point. Now, let me give you the operating system. First, examine every major purchase as a system bet. Ask what must remain stable for it to deliver its promised value. Second, distinguish durability from liquidity. An asset that physically survives may still become economically dead. Third, be especially suspicious of debt, funded lifestyle assets. In collapse, obligations tend to survive longer than usefulness. Fourth, understand that nominal promises are not the same as real protection. Insurance, pensions, and long-term contracts fail when the unit of account fails. Fifth, Separate knowledge from credential value. Skills endure better than institutional signaling when labor markets break. Sixth, prefer optionality over consumption weight. The more your wealth is trapped in hard to sell network, dependent maintenance, heavy goods, the less flexible you are when systems change. Seventh, recognize that the middle class is most exposed because it is most deeply entangled with formal institutions. That is not politics. It is structure. That is the heart of it. The 5 purchases are not random. They are the 5 most common expressions of trust in systemic continuity. That is why they fail together. Now let me end where this really matters. You can keep looking at these purchases as proof of stability. You can keep believing that because the object is real, the value must also be real. You can keep assuming that what worked in a functioning middle-class economy will continue working under, or you can do the harder thing. You can ask what hidden promises each purchase contains. You can ask whether those promises are stronger than you were taught to believe. You can stop measuring wealth only by what you possess and start measuring it by what remains useful if the system behind possession weakens. That is the threshold, because collapse does not usually take things away from you in the way movies suggest. It leaves them there and forces you to realize that what you really bought was never the object itself. It was the system around it. That is the mirror. Look into it carefully. If the system fails, the purchase can survive physically and still die economically. That is the lesson most people learn too late. You do not have to.